Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Richard Reeves. I'm a senior fellow here at the Brookings Institution. Welcome to the virtual Brookings stage. Today's event is jointly hosted between the Brookings Institution and the American Enterprise Institute, and we're jointly very proud to be helping to launch what is now the 8th edition of the American Family Survey. 8 sounds like a lot to those of us who've been involved. Can't quite believe that it's 8 years. Of course, the pandemic years don't count because time went into a warp that we'll never all recover from. But nonetheless, 8 years and strong. The American Family Survey is a partnership between Brigham Young University and the Deseret News, and has been from its outset. I count myself very honored to be on the advisory group to the survey, as is one of our panelists today, Brad Wilcox. The purpose of the survey is to look at many of the economic, social, political, and cultural trends in our society, but specifically through the lens of family life, and to bring a distinctly family-oriented perspective to some of those questions. And so much of what you'll hear today will be of relevance more generally, but I hope you'll also hear that the specific intent of this is to look at how those trends both express what's happening in American families and impact what's happening in American families, hence the title, The American Family Survey. And so the order of events is that we're going to hear from the principal authors of the survey, Chris Karpowitz and then Jeremy Pope. And then we're going to move into a discussion with Chris and Jeremy, but then bringing in my close colleague, Elaine Kmark, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Governance Studies, and Brad Wilcox from the American Enterprise Institute and the Institute of Family Studies, who, as I said, is also an advisor to the survey. Please join in. Please send your questions to events@brookings.edu or online, social media, using the hashtag American Family Survey. So I'll hope to get to those questions as well. But without further ado, let's get into the main event and hear the top lines from this, the 8th annual American Family Survey, from Chris and Jeremy. So Chris, over to you first, I think.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's delightful to be here. And we do want to review some of the main findings of the survey. It's a large survey. There's a lot to talk about, and so we won't be able to discuss everything, but we are delighted to be able to talk about at least some of our main findings to this point. So we have several slides, and we'll just kind of run through them. As Richard indicates, the American Family Survey is in its 8th year. It's a national survey of 3,000 Americans, and the sample is meant to mirror the general population of the United States. We want to talk a little bit about the challenges that Americans see facing American families as COVID recedes. We want to talk a little bit about what's happening with relationships and family life, and then we'll turn to some policy issues. My colleague Jeremy will discuss those with a special focus on schools and the role of parents in schools and how Americans see that. Let's start, though, with some challenges facing families. The New York Times today has some data about how racial and ethnic gaps in the response to COVID may have narrowed in recent years. But when we ask American families to look back on their experience so far with COVID, we do find the legacy of gaps that may have existed earlier or that continue. 3 in 10 Black and Hispanic Americans say they have a family member, either in their household or an extended family member, who died from COVID, compared to less than 1 in 5 white respondents to the survey. So certainly we do see some evidence that COVID affected American families in different ways. We also asked about the importance of both COVID-19 and racial inequality as important issues facing American families. We've been asking these questions about the most important issues facing families all 8 years of the survey, but beginning in 2020, we asked half the sample to pick from a list of items that included COVID-19 and racial inequality. And you can see since 2020, concern for those two things has dropped rather precipitously, although there are still important divisions. So more than 20% of Black respondents continue in 2022 to say that COVID-19 and racial inequality are important issues facing families, compared to about 1 in 10 white respondents. There are also some important partisan differences in attention to racial inequality specifically. Again, more than around 20% or more of Democrats think that that's an important issue facing American families. For moderate and conservative Republicans, it's really not on the political agenda, or they don't see it as an issue facing families in the same way. Well, what is it that Americans agree on in terms of the challenges for families? One of the things they agree on is economic challenge, and especially inflation. Nearly 9 in 10 Americans say that inflation will affect their family finances in the coming year. And more than half say that they're very worried about this. More than half also think that their incomes are likely to fall behind prices in the coming year or two. And more than 80% say they've seen important increases in the cost of food and transportation, especially. About 6 in 10 say that those increases have been large. So in the face of those challenges, in the face of rising inflation, what's happening in terms of family life? Well, more Americans are saying that they have experienced economic crises. Since 2017, we've been asking respondents to the American Family Survey about whether or not they've experienced an important economic crisis in their life. And we list 6 of them. These are things like whether or not they paid an important bill or didn't pay it because of budgetary concerns, or whether they avoided going to the doctor or to the hospital because they couldn't afford it. And what we want you to see from this chart is that there's essentially 3 points in time. So in the pre-pandemic era, levels of economic crisis were high, especially for low-income Americans. Those crises decreased during the first 2 years of the pandemic. And so we see that trough in 2020 and 2021. But now in 2022, we see increasing concern, increasing reports of economic crises. And those increases are occurring across the income spectrum at roughly equal rates. So we're not quite back to the pre-pandemic rates, but the trend is worrisome. And we think this is something to continue to watch in coming years. What should government do to support families? Well, we asked this in 2021 and in 2022. We asked whether or not Americans would prefer that the government give money directly to families. In 2021 and in 2022, lots of families said that direct government aid was helpful to them. Low-income Americans were especially likely to say that this was very helpful, direct checks to families. And in 2021, we saw more support for that than for spending money on programs and institutions. In 2022, that gap has narrowed. And so we see support for both giving money directly to families and spending money on programs and institutions, and support for doing neither of those things has declined. Well, what are we seeing in terms of relationships and family life? This may look initially as like a very boring chart, but it's one of the most important things that we think we've found over the 8 years of the American Family Survey. What I want you to see is a decline since 2015 in the percentage of Americans who report being married, a decline of about 5 percentage points, and a corresponding increase of about 5 percentage points relative to 2015 in Americans saying that they're not in any relationship whatsoever. So it's not as though the decline seems to have been because people are cohabiting and in committed relationships. It's that they seem to have moved. The decline is a decline in marriage and an increase in those Americans who are not in any committed relationship whatsoever. Why does that matter? Well, it matters for several reasons, one of which is a sense of loneliness. beginning just before the pandemic, we started asking about loneliness, using a series of 3 questions about whether or not people said they felt a lack of companionship or felt left out or felt isolated. We never saw a gigantic increase through the pandemic in the percentage of Americans saying they felt lonely. Instead, what we see is that loneliness is really related to having a committed relationship. And married Americans are the least likely to feel lonely. And in fact, relative to 2019, loneliness has declined slightly among married and cohabiting Americans, while it's remained pretty constant among other groups. As we move out of the pandemic, whether or not we are completely out of it is not an issue we want to get into, but as we move into a new phase of the pandemic, we do see in 2022 an increase in Americans saying they're struggling to balance home and work life. And perhaps that has something to do with, going back to the office. But we think this is worth watching. Relative to the first 2 years of the pandemic, more Americans say they're struggling with balance, work-life balance in their lives. Last thing I want to talk about is sort of family life in America. We're going to talk a little bit about partisan differences, and we'll have more. Jeremy will have more to say about the different groups that we're showing here. But one of the things we want you to see is that even though there are differences across different partisan and ideological identities, there are also some similarities when it comes to family life. Across all these different groups, families eat dinner together, at least weekly. Many groups attend activities, many families attend family activities together and socialize with friends together. There's some differences in terms of worshiping together, but even though there are these differences, family life, the day-to-day life of families looks awfully similar in liberal families and in conservative families. To the extent that there are some differences, it's moderate Democrats and conservative Republicans who seem to be the most social in terms of attending activities, worshiping, socializing together. And so now we want to turn to policy opinions, and my colleague Jeremy Pope will take it from there.
Thanks, Chris. We're going to talk about 2 general policy areas: abortion and schools. That's not because we didn't ask about a number of other areas, but let's start there. On the slide that you see now, I want to talk a little bit about the way that we have constructed this, where we're talking about liberal Democrats, moderate Republicans, and conservative Republicans. We've generally used these as categories this year because ideology is a bit of a moving target and things are changing, as I'm sure anyone who follows politics and policy knows. We think it's useful to look inside of the parties to be able to say, who is it that is more liberal, more moderate, or more conservative within each of the parties? It leaves out independents, although sometimes we've shown the independents in some of these charts and graphs. And it certainly is the case that liberal Democrats are about 2/3 of the Democratic Party. And by that, we simply mean they labeled themselves liberal and they also describe themselves as a Democrat. Same thing for Republicans. Moderate Republicans make up less of the Republican Party. Only about 1/4 of Republicans see themselves as moderate. But I want to illustrate why it's useful to think in these categories by pushing your attention towards that column about whether or not abortion should be legal in all cases. 31% of the public agrees with this. And if you look across that row, whether it's legal in all cases, legal in most, or illegal in most, illegal in all, this question that we asked was really one that's been replicated across a number of different surveys, and it replicates very well. What I think is interesting to show here is that the moderates in both parties, the moderate Democrats and their moderate Republicans, do stand out. They're somewhat closer to each other. They're distinct from the conservative members of each party. About 1 in 5 moderate Republicans think that abortion should be legal in all cases. This is in contrast to 1 in 5 conservative Republicans who think it should be illegal in all cases. And when you stare at this chart and you think about it here for a second, you're going to realize there's actually quite a bit of nuance to opinion. And I hope that's something that comes out of our use of this category, liberal Democrats, moderate Republicans, and conservative Republicans, to be able to show how there's nuance within each party, and the coalitions as they are constructed contain, as we'll put it, opportunities for compromise in public opinion. I'm not trying to make a point about Congress or what will actually happen, just public opinion. I want to show you another chart now that's about the number of weeks, right? And so this is a question, essentially, at what point in the pregnancy do you think a woman should be able to legally obtain an abortion? And so over there on the left, you can see there are some people, a number of Republicans in red, over a third actually, think it should be never legal, or at least they report that question that way. When you look at the later columns, you see, well, some legality in the first trimester, second trimester, third, and then essentially the category always legal all the way up through 40 weeks. Though I emphasize the question was asked about weeks. And what you can see from this chart is that the weight of opinion is very clearly in the first trimester, maybe bleeding somewhat into the second trimester as well, right? That is where public opinion thinks abortion should be. If you look at just the averages, so people who say it's legal in all cases, legal in most, illegal in all, you see that even those who say that it should be legal in all cases actually on average want about 24 weeks. Even those who say it should be illegal in all cases actually say, well, about 5 weeks. And this illustrates some of the problems with looking narrowly at a single issue question. I think issue questions like the kind we ask on the survey can be very valuable, but you have to look across a number of issue questions to really understand what's going on. On this next slide, what we show here is, I think, probably the single most important slide on abortion. If you combine the questions about people who say that abortion should always be illegal and that it should be and consistently argue, yes, it should be available never, 0 weeks of availability. And you compare them to the number of Americans who favor total access, legal through 40 weeks, always legal, they're in favor of it. That is about 14% of the public. Now, I don't want to, this is a public opinion survey, we're describing what the public thinks. I'm not casting aspersions on anyone for holding any of those views. What I'm just trying to say is that 14% of the public holds the most common views that get talked about in the media. It's very clear that the parties do have some opportunity for compromise and dissent and complexity on the issue of abortion. 86% of Americans favor some degree of access and some degree of regulation. Now, how that's going to work is actually intriguing. Next question is one that we asked. I've never seen this asked anywhere else, and I really like this result, actually. I think this says something quite interesting. If you ask people, which of the following would you prefer? A single national policy on abortions that is consistent across all states, or variation in abortion policy with each state developing its own policy? It's split kind of 50-50. There's some degree of consent. I wouldn't say consensus. There are more people who say a national policy is better. Once you look at the two parties, you begin to see that it tends to be especially liberal Democrats. Less so, this is less true of moderate Democrats, and it's certainly not true of Republicans at all. They want a single national policy. Conservatives and Republicans, they think there should be variation in abortion policy. I ran sort of a little focus group with some students the other day trying to figure out what people were thinking about this. And the thing that came out of it for me is I think that people are on each side of the political spectrum, and I think this is consistent with the question, are interpreting the question in the following way. The left would prefer to see a sort of floor on abortion that is as permissive as possible, make sure that abortion is available in as many circumstances as possible. Whereas the right, to the degree they want any kind of national policy, they want local conditions to be able to restrict it. I think that's a pretty interesting result. I don't know how this is going to play out. I don't know what strategy the parties will actually be using, but I think one of the things we should have showed you here is that there is room for discussion and debate and compromise on the issue of abortion. Now let's turn to another issue, schools and parents, and I'm really going to emphasize parents in this section of the survey. We asked people about public schools, and we asked them when controversies arise, and I'll go through a few of the controversies in a second, who is it that should have the final say about what is taught in public schools about each of these following issues? Things like the books assigned, sex education, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, race, history of race and racism. And we found something that was overwhelmingly true virtually all of the time, that the answer for everyone is always parents. Now, since my training is in political science and was originally more in institutions than anything else, I feel sort of contractually obligated to note here, public schools are controlled by the public. They are not controlled by parents alone, but I'm sure lots of people here are aware of the salience of this issue. Was used supposedly to at least some effect by Governor Youngkin in Virginia in that election last year. And it holds up really, really well. I'm not going to show you the other pictures or the other data that we've looked at, but if you try to push on this and find the areas where, say, liberal Democrats are more open to somebody besides parents deciding, there are a few, maybe on the history of race in America, they might be interested in letting classroom teachers make some decisions, but it is a pretty overwhelming, pretty consistent finding that parents should be in charge. Now, that doesn't really solve a lot of the problems. As we look on this next slide, what you're going to see is that there are controversies that are pretty significant. Let's just focus on the left for a second. The question here is, do you think that schools today spend too much time, the right amount, or too little time teaching about the following topics? And what we're showing you are the percentage who say schools emphasize the topic too little. And it's broken down by the different ideological and partisan categories that I've already mentioned. Obviously, on the left, they are very sure that schools are spending too little time talking about race. And they're almost equally sure, maybe not almost, but they're fairly sure that schools are spending too little time talking about sexual orientation and gender identity. If you look over on the right-hand side of the chart, you can actually get the same thing on social and emotional learning. But I'm going to turn to the middle categories, math, government, and science. This is an area where there's frankly more agreement, especially on government and on science. Both conservative and liberal Democrats want to see more emphasis placed on those things. Chris and I were just discussing this morning. We don't really know why conservative Republicans are the ones that are really into math, but that is the finding that is there. My point here, though, is there are areas of consensus. There are areas of reasonable disagreement. And I think this slide highlights both of those, actually. On this slide, I'm going to talk about sex education for just a second. How much do you agree or disagree with these statements? You're satisfied with the level of sex education? There's a lot of non-opinion about this. There are a lot of people saying they neither agree nor disagree. Some people are particularly dissatisfied with that. It is the case, if you look down at the bullet, satisfaction with sex education, about 4 in 10 fathers are satisfied, only about 3 in 10 mothers are satisfied. It's an interesting gender difference. Maybe we'll talk about that in the Q&A. Liberal Democrats are more likely than Republicans to believe it is a really important topic for schools to teach. In fact, it's really essentially twice as many Republicans. But I note again the nuance. Moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans are about equally likely to agree about the importance of sex ed. People want it to be taught. They are worried about how it will be taught. Okay. I may say more about that in a second, but let me talk about books before I turn to kind of a summary. One of the things that is becoming increasingly a point of debate in American politics is what kind of books are in school libraries, what kind of books are assigned. We asked a number of different questions about this. I'll highlight 3. The public schools in my area include books that should be removed because they're inappropriate. And then in that second row, if a parent objects to a book, that book should be removed, even if other parents like the book. There really aren't that many people that strongly agree with that or even agree with it. It's 16% and 12% respectively. It's really that bottom category. It is important for public school libraries to have books that represent a variety of perspectives about controversial issues. Even if some people are uncomfortable, 2/3 of the public agrees with that statement. There isn't a burning desire in the public to pull back on perspectives, to ban books, and this sort of thing. I just want to sum up quickly so we can get as speedily as possible into what I'm sure will be excellent comments and reactions to the survey. The American Family Survey, one of its great strengths is being able to talk about change. And Chris and I are united in this belief that economic change is likely to be something that is important in the next few years. We're already seeing the first stirrings as we come out of COVID of people being very worried about inflation, people facing more crises. And we think that is likely to just get more and more complicated. The survey has long had, and is going to continue to have, I think, a perspective that there are areas of disagreement and there are areas where compromise is possible. Maybe it's impossible because the parties are not going to be able to put together a compromise in Washington, but it's not possible. It's not impossible because the public doesn't see areas for compromise. We tried to highlight that with abortion. The truth is we have findings in the survey about immigration and other areas as well where compromise is possible. One of the things, since we look hard at school debates, that we think is true is that one of the ways in which we compromise these things is by allowing lots of considerable local variation on issues. And I think that's what we get out of the survey on education. People believe parents should control public schools. And what they mean by that in part is that parents locally should be able to control public schools. They're hopeful that parents and their community values what is going on in their community will prevail. Now, that doesn't mean that Tuscaloosa, Alabama is going to have the same public school system that Marin County, California does. But it does mean that parents are, in general, the ones that should be in charge. These are just some of the findings that we have in the survey and some of the things that we hope are thought-provoking and will push us towards a good discussion. Thank you for listening, everybody.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, Chris, as always, for such a succinct summary of what is a huge survey. I strongly encourage everybody to dig further into the survey on some of the other issues. We'll get a couple of comments now from our two panelists, and then I hope that when we broaden this out, we can actually involve Chris and or Jeremy in questions that arise. But first, I'm going to turn to Elaine Kmark, who I've already introduced. Elaine has written a good deal on the politics of reproductive rights and abortion, so I thoroughly recommend her recent writing on this. I suspect Elaine's going to touch on that issue in her responses. But Elaine, over to you to give your general response as to what do you think, what are your main takeaways here? And then we'll come to Brad.
Great. Well, I have two comments, sort of different, each one different. I did have a look at your complete survey before we got on this webinar. And I was struck by the very beginning of it, by the dramatic drop in optimism among particularly non-parents in the United States. I mean, why? It didn't seem to me that there would be any particularly large reason for that to happen. But non-parents seem to think that, boy, the next generation is really doomed. And parents had a big different. And so I'd like to, throw this back to the people who did the survey and ask what they think about this. On abortion, I think that you're absolutely right. And your data confirm what we've seen in many other surveys over the years, which is there is a very big middle in the abortion debate. The problem is that in the two political parties, each extreme plays a bigger role within the party than it does in the nation as a whole. So, for instance, if you're a Democrat and you're running in a Democratic primary, you want the support of the most liberal Democrats because they are, in fact, the ones who are likely to come out and vote in the primary. And certainly, and even more so, frankly, because I want to make the point that I believe polarization has been asymmetric. In the Republican Party, God forbid that you don't look extremely pro-life, because in fact, that's what a large portion of the Republican base, particularly the evangelical portion, wants. So the primary system itself exacerbates the extremes, even though as Chris and Jeremy have shown so well, even though the public is in fact, very few of them are at either extremes. So I think that that's one thing about our political system. The second thing I'll say is that, and I wrote a little bit about this before, in politics, intensity matters. And intensity causes people to vote, it causes people to give money, etc. I think that for women, regardless of their age, and frankly, regardless of their feeling about on that spectrum of abortion, issues of reproductive freedom are incredibly important in a way that they simply aren't to men. Which is no reflection on men. It's just that men don't live this day to day, year to year, the way women do from the time they menstruate to the time they're well into menopause. And so this is a different political issue. And I'm not sure that it won't be a very much more definitive issue in this election than you can tell from the polling. Okay. And what's happening is that there are things arising, like the situation in South Carolina, where a young woman who wanted her baby had a placental rupture. She almost lost her uterus. She almost died. And the doctors refused to help her right away because they weren't sure what the law was. She needed an abortion. She needed a medical abortion. And the state rep in South Carolina, who had voted for this very stringent law, said, "Oh, wow, I didn't know this. Obviously, we have to write a bunch of exceptions into the law." So what did they do? The South Carolina legislature wrote 14 exceptions into the law stating when a woman can have a medical abortion, in an effort to try to, make clear what the doctors could do and couldn't do. Well, you got to ask yourself, how the heck do a bunch of guys, frankly, in the South Carolina legislature know the complete range of situations in which abortion might be medically necessary? That's something that only doctors know, and they know it case by case. So we're beginning to see here just how difficult it will be to actually enforce these abortion bans. And men may say, "Oh, well, I don't get it. I don't get how did this happen?" Right? Women know this very well, and they know that their lives are on the line. So my prediction here is that polling is missing an issue of intensity that I think could have enormous consequences in this election and into the future.
Thanks, Elaine. I just want to briefly come back to you on this, and then we'll move to Brad. Do you think that intensity, though, is on both sides? You've obviously stressed the intensity on one side, but there's a strong intensity on the pro-life side too, right? Or are you saying there's asymmetric intensity is what I'm asking?
It's asymmetric. Look, we already have had a case. We had Kansas. We had a very deep red state, and you had a 20-point, when the issue was just put to people, you had a 20-point difference. And I believe there are plenty of women who would never have an abortion, who are practicing Catholics like myself, who would never have an abortion, who understand that sometimes, you just can't have the law getting into this. It just doesn't work. It's a mess, and people are going to die because of it. So I believe that it is asymmetric, that all the people who are extreme in the pro-life side are already in the electorate. They've been in the electorate for a long time, and they've done a good job electing people, and that now this has mobilized a kind of silent majority, if you will. And I suspect we'll see that the next referendum on this is in Michigan and Kentucky this fall. So we will see if Kansas repeats itself, and then we'll see if there's a follow-on impact onto Democratic candidates.
Okay, thanks, Elaine. Brad, over to you to pick up on anything Elaine has said or go in a different direction, but your response overall to the survey.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go in a bit of a different direction than Elaine was going in. One of, I think, the sort of striking pieces of good news in this new survey is the way in which it basically shows that conservative Americans, more religious Americans today, are much more likely to be flourishing compared to their liberal and secular peers in the United States. So, it's just kind of really striking evidence in the survey. So conservatives are 16 percentage points more likely to be completely satisfied with their lives. Religious Americans who regularly attend, church or other services are 21 percentage points more likely to be completely satisfied with their lives. And when you kind of look at these numbers and you kind of go behind the scenes to kind of unpack what accounts for these kind of amazing differences between conservatives and liberals, between religious and secular Americans, you find actually appropriately enough that family is crucial to understanding this set of divides. What we see is that once you control for marital status, once you control for family satisfaction, these conservative and religious advantages disappear. And that's because conservatives are about 20 percentage points more likely to be married, and they're about 17 percentage points more likely to be satisfied with their families. And much the same story is true for religious Americans. So again, what's kind of striking about the survey is that we can see that being married and having a satisfying family life is integrally tied to being happy with your life in general. And in this regard, conservatives and religious Americans have a major advantage. So that's in a sense, from my more conservative perspective, as compared to Elaine's perspective, one of the pieces of good news in the survey. And of course, the bad news coming out of the survey, again, from my vantage point, is that our core social institutions continue to lose ground. Marriage is down in the survey to 45% of adults reporting that they're married. We're seeing, religious attendance down. We're seeing kind of support for marriage as institution across the 8 years come down. So there's a kind of erosion, I think, in the values and the virtues institutions that have long kind of given Americans a sense of meaning, direction, and purpose. And that's in part, of course, I think, because our progressive Americans who tend to dominate, much of our elite institutions, I think are not as supportive of these core institutions, things like marriage, for instance. I can't tell you how many articles I've seen in the New York Times, in Atlantic, more most recently in Bloomberg, kind of discounting marriage, for instance. So Bloomberg had this article just, a month ago saying, quote, women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer, unquote, compared to other women. Now, this is just completely false. I mean, if you look at the American Community Survey, for instance, you find that the richest group of women in America are those women who are married with kids. In the American Family Survey, we see that women who are married with kids are markedly more satisfied with their lives compared to women who are single and childless. So there's just kind of like this, false narrative that I think, unfortunately, too many progressives have kind of latched onto. They're kind of embracing a kind of individualism that makes them more reluctant to, I think, revisit our core institutions like family and faith. So to wrap it up, I think the challenge for progressives, as I wrote in the New York Times last Thanksgiving, is to sort of understand and appreciate that in their own way, kind of, family and faith are, going to be integral to any kind of successful way of life. And if progressives can't kind of get behind those institutions, again, on their own terms, they're going to continue, I think, to sort of do relatively worse on any number of fronts, financially, emotionally, socially, on average. And I think the challenge for conservatives, of course, is to do a better job of articulating sort of the meaning and the power of these institutions, to find kind of new cultural platforms to communicate the value of these institutions that sort of work around, much of sort of the standard platforms in the academy and media, because those platforms, unfortunately, are really not very hospitable to a kind of family-friendly or faith-friendly message these days. And then also, I think for conservatives to revisit their aversion to embracing public policies that would make marriage and family life more accessible to working class and middle class Americans. So that's, I think, kind of where we stand in terms of my perspective on some of the results from this latest round of the American Family Survey.
Thanks, Brad. Let me come. I want to ask a question. I know Elaine wants to come back too, and then actually, Jeremy and Chris, I'd love to pull you in on a couple of things: the optimism point and the intensity point. So, I'm talking to the tech people here now. I think it'd be great if we could elevate you back. But Brad, I'm very interested in this marriage thing, because one of the findings that stuck out to me was the one where it showed worship by moderate Democrats, and the percentage of moderate Democrat families who said they're regularly worshiping together was what, 39% or something. It was obviously for liberal Democrats really high, but it was higher than for moderate Republicans. Am I remembering the chart correctly?
That's right.
And so I wonder again if there isn't this slight issue here with dare I say, overweighting what's on the New York Times editorial page.
Sure.
In terms of how people are actually living, right? And actually moderate Democrats are mostly getting married because college educated people are getting married, and they're disproportionately Democrat. And so on the one hand, you've got the sort of New York Times problem, let's call it that. Apologies to all our dear friends at the New York Times listening to this, but then you've got everybody else that's actually just, worshiping and getting married, right?
Well, Richard, I think on the moderate Democrats, and Jeremy and Chris can correct me if I'm wrong here, but that's partly a race story, right? So moderate Democrats are much more likely to be African Americans, and they're also more likely to be regularly found in church on any given Sunday. So that's part of the moderate Democrat story. But in general, we do see when you kind of put together both conservatives and liberals as a whole group, and you can put together Republicans and Democrats as whole groups, and you compare where they stand on being married today, you do find these enormous gaps, so I'm just saying, on average, we are seeing kind of both major ideological and partisan and religious divides in terms of who's getting married today, and also actually who's having children as well. So, I think these divides are actually growing larger. And this is sort of part of the challenge I think facing the country, is that, we're just seeing dramatically different views on questions related to things like abortion, like Elaine was articulating, and of course there's extremes there, but these differences also extend to marriage as well.
I don't know. I mean, this is an empirical question to which I should know the answer. But given that marriage is so much more common among college-educated Americans, and given that college-educated Americans are increasingly associated with the Democrat Party, seems to me empirically it may well be true that controlling for age, marriage rates are higher among Democrats than probably. Anyway, Elaine, you jump in.
That's exactly what I was going to say earlier. I think, I agree with Brad in terms of the social importance of marriage. I think it does make people happier. I think it does make people more wealthy. There's just a lot of good things about marriage. But I also think that what we're seeing in this, I would like to see you guys break it out by age. Liberal Democrats are younger than Republicans. They're simply, in this day and age, they're simply younger. That started with Obama. If Obama had not had the under 30 vote, he would have lost. Okay, that's how dramatically different this younger generation is. So as they get, so give them some time, they haven't gotten married yet. They haven't found anybody yet. They haven't had children yet. I mean, this whole business of family formation takes a while. And I think that what we've seen over the course of the 20th century is it just happens later and later. So I think that age is probably pretty significant here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Elaine. That it will be interesting to see what happens as younger, more secular, more liberal Democrats sort of grow older, and whether they're forming family connections and relationships in quite the same way. I mean, I guess one of the things I would say is I see both sides missing one part of the equation. So when we look at, what is the most important issue facing families? Liberals tend to say that it's economic, and that's a really important thing. And to the extent that the conservatives downplay that, they're missing an important part of the story. Conservatives tend to say that it's structural, that it's about forming families and being married, and they tend to downplay, the economic concerns. And I think that also is half the story. Both of those stories together are important. The economic challenges facing families today are absolutely real. And the structure of family life is meaningful in doing things like reducing levels of loneliness, as we tried to talk about. And so it worries me a lot that the decline in marriage is accompanied by an increase in not being in any relationship whatsoever. So being in some sort of committed relationship really does help. And I do worry if people are sort of opting out of any sort of relationship whatsoever, or unable to find those relationships for whatever reason.
Yeah, that's what I agree. It stood out when I saw that top line. I thought, oh, well, it'll be cohabitation. And it wasn't, and so I wondered a bit about the pandemic, of course, but I think the retreat from relationships is the story, not just the retreat from marriage. Of course, those things are related. But Jeremy, do you want to weigh in? And in particular, maybe you can pick up Elaine's point. I was struck by the sort of gloominess of the non-parents as well. And there is this whole local global problem with these surveys, right? If you say, are your kids going to be okay? People tend to say yes. If you say, are kids in general going to be okay? People say no. So there is a local global thing here. Is that all we're seeing in the parent non-parent thing there, or is there something else going on?
I'd be reluctant to say that it's the only thing that we're seeing in that. I think Elaine's point is well taken, and it bears watching. But the problem is, doing this survey, we have 8 years, and so there are many comparisons that we can make. But we're coming out of the pandemic. I don't need to explain to anyone how destabilizing that was. And we're not coming out of it into a new stable era. We're coming out of it into an era of fairly dramatic inflation. And we tried to emphasize this in the report, but I think it simply cannot be underplayed how important inflation is going to be in the next few years, unless it abates more quickly than most economists that I read are telling me that it's going to. And so I think we're just going to need more time to figure out what that pessimism refers to. Is it a hangover from COVID? Is it pessimism that is more structural? Is it, I'll admit I like this hypothesis best, but I don't know that I could prove this. Is it something that has more to do with a gloomy economic outlook and the fact that it's harder to fill up my car in some places or to eat meat on the regular basis that I might want to? All of those things are viable hypotheses. And I think it bears watching, but I don't know which one of those is true right now.
So they're filling a general sense of more pessimism. Yeah. Elaine, did you have any response to that?
Well, and some of this may simply be, I think, as you pointed out, Richard, that parents are loath to say, I'm doing a bad job. My kids are going to be a mess, right? Parents are going to have to have an optimistic point of view. But I think overall that drop that you all showed, it is actually concerning, because if I'm remembering this, there was a drop for parents as well as for the non-parents. It was just there was a divide between the two. So I think that is concerning, and it would be. I'm not sure that traditional surveys can answer that question very well. But
well, I think on the sort of pessimism we're seeing in the survey about kind of sort of the prospects for our kids vis-a-vis the American dream, I think it certainly makes sense in part, right? Because, given the trends that we're seeing in American families, and Richard's own work suggests that, kids who are raised in stable families are more likely to realize the American dream. Raj Chetty's work comes to the same conclusion. So if we're seeing kind of high levels of family instability mark the lives of American kids, and that does mean that, many of them are going to be floundering financially. I also wanted to note too that the irrepressible Lyman Stone has already just crunched the numbers in the American Family Survey with controls for age, and finds that there is a significant relationship between being more conservative and being more likely to either be married in the first place or planning to get married in the second place, even controlling for age in the American Family Survey. So we can come back to the issue, but my hypothesis is that as you look at trends on a different front, for instance, the General Social Survey finds no gap by partisanship in the share of Americans who are married ages 18 to 55 in 1990, whereas it finds more recently about a 13 percentage point gap between Republicans and everyone else in terms of who's married. So I do think as we go forward, we're going to see larger, and also finds a big divide religiously as well. I just think that given the kinds of cultural currents that are now kind of, especially since the woke revolution of 2014, when it comes to things like gender, for instance, I think we are going to see, some growing divides on both partisan and ideological and religious lines in terms of who's getting married and who's having kids and how many kids they're having. I could be wrong, but I think that the cultural divisions that we're seeing in our society will kind of be reinforcing these differences.
Well, I'd love to hear from Jeremy and Chris on this, and maybe if Lyman, so is Lyman watching this and running regressions as we speak? Okay, so Lyman, Lyman, can you control for education as well? While you're at it, and maybe we won't get it. It's not going to get in a peer-reviewed journal probably in the next 25 minutes.
He just controlled for education too. Same story.
Okay, fine. Okay, good. All right. So, all right. Well, maybe just haven't joined the call. But on this specific question, Chris or Jeremy, I'd love to hear any thoughts you might have, and then I want to move on to another subject.
Yeah, well, I haven't been in a situation where I've been, where we're doing regressions on the fly like this. So I'd have to.
No, it's not necessarily recommended, no matter how.
Yeah.
So I think everybody listening to this, fair enough, fair health warning. But
I have a thought on this that it's a bit of a tangent, but it will circle back, and it speaks to. I know this isn't what Elaine was talking about when she talked about partisan asymmetries, but I want to go back to that slide. We don't have to put it up. The one that showed that it's the moderate Democrats and the conservative Republicans that are worshipful and are sort of more connected to their families.
Yes.
I just want to make the point that the interesting asymmetry to me between the two parties at the moment is that for Democrats, the family enthused, and I agree with Brad that this very much has to do with race. The family most engaged group of people who are also most religious tend to be non-white and tend to be moderate. They're on that wing of the party. Whereas for Republicans, it's exactly the opposite. The most, religiously engaged, most ideologically committed, they're the conservative Republicans. And I think this asymmetry is one that I just don't know how it's going to play out. I mean, maybe Brad's right that we're going to see sort of big differences and a gap opening up between the parties. What I wonder about as a possibility is that you're going to see gaps opening inside of the parties that are difficult for the parties to talk about. Because when Black and Hispanic Americans who have a much more moderate view of life, who are less friendly, to be blunt, on issues like transgender rights or sometimes economic policy and sometimes other things, they are not going to be simpatico with liberal Democrats. It makes it a more difficult position for Democrats who are going to find that group that they need to hold together to figure out what the party position is in a different place than Republicans, for whom the most ideologically most extreme group, but are also most religious and most engaged with family, are on the right of their party. I find that something to be hard to predict, but it's a truth that I think is underplayed about ideology and partisanship in American politics.
And it means building coalitions within the parties. So, I chanced a quick out. Molly Reynolds, our colleague here at Brookings, was talking last night at an event for Alice Rivlin about coalitions within parties becoming much more important in the context of all kinds of things, including filibuster, and these differences within parties being somewhat overlooked right now in the debate about partisanship.
Yes. And the parties have, in a sense, asymmetric problems. The Republicans have a coalition that has to reach out to people that are more secular and very different to build the kind of coalition that they're looking for. Democrats, their base is the sort of highly secular one, but if they want to get to a majority, they have to reach out to the middle and the other part of the coalition inside of their party that is just very different, much more church attending, more family friendly. And I don't really know which way this is going to go over time. I don't really disagree with Brad. I just think it's probably a more complex story inside of each party.
I do think.
Well, you make it sound easy, Jeremy, but I can maybe it's not as easy as it sounds for the Democrats right now. But anyway, I know Lane has views on that. Chris.
No, I think Jeremy's right, and I think paying attention to the segments within the Democratic Party who are more involved in worship, regular worship, I think is a really important thing to do going forward. The other thing I would say is that. Richard, as you've pointed out, right, there are educational differences too, in terms of the extent to which people are likely to get married. And so I worry a lot. The group I worry about the most is the group that seems to have accepted this sort of cultural message that marriage isn't so great and are not doing it at all. And we don't see that in better educated and higher income folks on the left too. They're going ahead and getting married. And so I think part of the challenge on the left is, how do you talk about marriage in a way that takes seriously gender equality and other commitments that are really important to the left? And I think sometimes the way it's talked about is sort of problematic because it is sort of lumped together with all sorts of things in the past that we haven't liked. The other thing I will say is that in terms of the choice to get married, I think young people today see the economic bar as being much higher than previous generations saw.
For marriage specifically.
For marriage, the economic bar to get married, and the number of sort of prerequisites that you have to check off before it's okay to get married. That is a big difference across the cohorts, and so I think that bears some attention as well. What should that bar be, if any, right? So the oldest age cohorts, when we've asked them in past American Family Surveys, have basically said, get married first and these other things will follow, right? But I don't think that's the way young people today tend to think of it.
No.
Okay, thank you. I want to come back to on a different topic now to Elaine and then Brad, which is this issue of how this might affect public policy with regard to families. So there is this question that's been asked in the survey, which was intended to get at the distinction between just giving money to people. Right? Obviously, we can think about things like child tax credit and so on, and instead investing in services, say through schools, say through job training programs or whatever. And it was to get at, like, if we're going to support families, should we just give them money or provide services? And this year, the answer was yes, please, if I understood it correctly. Yeah, we'll have all of that. And so I wonder, to the extent that could just be a sense of recoil from the current economic situation. But how did you read that result, Elaine? Or more generally, how did you read the survey as someone's thinking about the role of government, the role of public policy, these huge debates we've got right now about things like child tax credit, about investments in families, the role of just state transfers and so on too? I guess particularly for thinking about it from a maybe a center-left perspective, like if you were advising a Democrat on this, what would you say? But maybe also then if you're advising, say, a moderate Republican on this, a Romney or a Rubio, what would you be saying in terms of the results here? What are the political implications, do you think, for policy?
Well, I think there's a critical balance here between giving money through, say, the child tax credit, okay, which is a central issue here, through the child tax credit or through programs. And the problem is that we tend to think that it's an either or. You have to have programs because, in fact, there are, and there always have been, families, mostly unmarried mothers with children, who are in a mess, okay? A mess. There's illiteracy. There's drug and alcohol dependency. There's, irregular employment. There's a lack of a social structure around them. Those are the people who end up in programs. You get rid of programs and you're going to have an awful lot of sad situations in the country, even sadder than they already are. For the vast majority of parents, however, who are kind of coping, etc., they need money. Okay, they need help. They need a child tax credit. They need they need child care assistance. They need higher quality child care or a child care voucher or something like that. So you have to realize that the programs are, in fact, very carefully structured for people who really have serious problems coping. And that's why you can't say it's either or, because you will have people who need social workers in their lives, who need social workers to say, do this, do that, you better go to this drug rehab program, here's what your kids should be doing, etc. That is not, fortunately, the vast majority of American families who just need a little financial help. So I think you always have to do both as a matter of public policy, and you have to make sure that the real problem group that you're dealing with, that the programs actually are effective. Or else the first thing you get is people saying, why should we have programs?
Yeah, so there's a cash and a care element too, and I think it's worth saying, and Chris and Jeremy will tell me if this is wrong, the question's very vague, and so there could well be some differences in terms of what they mean. Like when they say yes, you should spend, they might have very different views on that. But nonetheless, Brad, I love your views on this, because you've been quite outspoken on the need for a conservative pro-family policy, which does include significant income transfers. It does include a very active role for government in supporting families, which obviously is not the view held by some of those on the right. So you must have been, were you pleased to see that? I mean, more on the left than the right, but.
So let me say just two things, Richard. I think on the first point, I think the first thing I would say is I think the challenge now with conservatives and just Americans more generally, I think there's a kind of a new kind of hesitation when it comes to spending on both programs and spending on, just giving families a generous, child allowance, for instance, because of this issue of inflation that we're confronting. So I think that's one sort of challenge that's going to be salient for, especially for us Republicans who would like, or conservatives who'd like, for the Republican Party to become more active on family policy. The second thing that I wanted to mention, though, is when you look at trends, Richard, as you and Bell did in your book on the middle class, in terms of kind of family income, what you see is the group that's sort of seen the most stagnation in the last few decades is sort of that working and middle class segment. And both the rich have obviously done very well, but the poor have done comparatively well too, because of all the programs that Elaine was commenting on just a few minutes ago. And so I think from my perspective, as someone who's interested in thinking about kind of making working class and middle class family life more attractive, more successful, more stable. I think that's sort of a tragedy. And we should be sort of rethinking our tax and transfer programs so that they are linked more to work and marriage being, basically pathways to prosperity for people with a lower income distribution. So we need to be thinking about reforming programs like Medicaid, for instance, in ways that don't penalize working that extra hours, and losing your Medicaid or marrying the father of your kids. Like I talked to one couple in Virginia who weren't getting married because they lose Medicaid in Virginia. So we need to think about how do we look at our programs with an eye towards making work and marriage more appealing and attractive and financially remunerative for working class couples and families.
Yeah, I agree. I think of this group as the group that between the safety net and the people who benefit from the SALT deduction. Right. Everyone in between those two groups essentially are the ones where we do see this kind of income. It's not. I'm not suggesting safety net is perfect by any means, but you're right. They're from a much lower base. You have seen more support going to those at the bottom, but it is right in the middle. And in fact, and this comes back a bit to Chris's point about marriage. Now, the work from Heather Boucher and others shows that the only thing that's propped up middle class incomes has been the rise in the earnings and employment of women, which is obviously in and of itself a fantastic thing, but it's also really come to the rescue of middle class family incomes. And men's earnings and employment would actually have been a drag down on incomes. So I wanted to build on something up, but and Elaine, did you want to respond to that? I wasn't sure if you were.
No, I think that's good. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm very interested in. So obviously, you got these questions on education. Let's talk a bit about that because that's obviously a hot issue. You had these great questions about like who should be in charge, parents. I had the slight sense that was particularly this moment a bit of a yay saying question in a way, which is like who's going to be against the idea of parents having a say. And so I didn't honestly know quite how to interpret that result. Because you had parents and then you had like federal government, state government, school. You had a list of bureaucrats or parents. And so I don't know. I mean, I'd love to know what Elaine and Brad think about that. I looked at that and I thought, you know what? I don't really know what to make of that answer, honestly, given the way it was framed. So tell me if I'm being unfair, and if I'm being unfair, then tell me what this means politically, other than just like people like parents, especially if they're parents.
Listen, Richard, I had the same reaction you did, right?
Okay,
which is
fine. Okay, so we're both being unfair. Okay.
Yeah. No, I don't think you're being fair. I don't know what that means. And the fact of the matter is that listen, I always go back when it comes to education to an experience I had in the 2000 campaign, where I was traveling with Vice President Al Gore, and it was of course against George W. Bush, and the two of them spent much of the campaign talking as if they were running for president of the school board instead of president of the United States. The amount of time in that campaign they spent on education, K through 12, was really sort of funny if you think about it, because of course Al Gore knew full well, as did George Bush, that the president of the United States spends about almost zero time in an average day on education. Education is very local. So obviously when parents get excited about something, pro or con, right, they're a big force to be dealt with locally, because it's easy for them to access local situations and local school boards, as opposed to, say, the U.S. Department of Education. So, I mean, I do think that, yes, parents say that because, in fact, they want to be able to get in there if need be. Most of the time, however, they're not. Now, there's been a resurgence on the right of parents who are going to school boards and far-right activists taking over school boards, et cetera. But again, there are tens of thousands of school boards in the United States. And so I kind of think that's a tough one. That's a tough one.
Yeah. Brad, I'd love your views on this too, and then maybe Chris.
Yeah, here actually,
what did you hear?
Well, I think Elaine was right, and I'm pro-life and I'm Catholic, so I don't agree with her on the substance, but I think she was right on the politics about her comments regarding the way in which this whole Dobbs decision is played politically. I think she's exactly right that it's helped the Democratic Party, but I think one reason that we're talking about a very competitive race coming up in November is because these issues, whether to race and gender in schools, the way in which our schools are handling these issues, play to the Republican advantage. I mean, most parents, when they see some of these new curricula, just either roll their eyes or their jaw drops in horror. I mean, I've been, the parent of kids in public schools in Albemarle County in Virginia, and which was for a very long time a very strong, school system. But there's been a dramatic shift in our local public schools in the direction of sort of stressing a very, I would say, radical, progressive gender and racialist ideology, and de-emphasizing, more meritocratic approaches to education. And, I think a lot of parents in the middle have become uncomfortable with, what's happening and have given people like, Glenn Youngkin, support to put him over the top. And I think the same things happened also in Florida with Ron DeSantis as well. So I think here we have a different cultural issue. It's kind of pushing, a lot of people in the middle in the direction of the Republican Party. And unless and until the Democrats kind of cool it with some of this, stuff related to a more racialist and, kind of very progressive gender agenda and focus on things like math and science and English, where our kids are not actually doing all that well. If the Democrats can muster kind of the strength to return to the basics when it comes to our schools, I think they'll do a lot better in these, political contests. But right now, they haven't been able to shift gears in local schools.
Well, Youngkin did win big among K-12 parents. As to whether that's COVID, race. There was a lot in it. Elaine.
Yeah.
But I would say to that, Brad, I think the lesson has been learned. Whether it will get effect. We just surveyed, we didn't survey, we just coded 2,360 rather, congressional primary candidates in both parties. And we asked about all of these issues, including the education one, critical race theory. We found almost no Democrats, under 10 Democrats, even mentioning the issue. They just stayed away from it. They didn't talk about it. They said, more money for education, this, that, and the other thing. They did not talk about it. Now, the Republicans do a very good job at making this an issue, but it is not there in the candidates of the party. It simply wasn't there, nor was, defund the police. That was gone too. So I think what's happened is that the Democrats allowed a fringe of the party to have their say, and in doing so, created an opening for the Republicans to say this is the whole Democratic Party. It simply isn't. It just simply isn't.
Could I? Oh,
Chris,
sorry,
Chris and Jeremy. Yeah, let's hear from you now.
Yeah, I would say that we also wondered exactly what to think and what the right set of response options was for this question about parental control, and who are the other figures that we should put on that question. And I would agree completely with Elaine that most parents, even if they sort of in a general sense say, yeah, parents should ultimately have a say, are not actively sort of engaged on most of these issues, and most wouldn't be prepared to do that, even if they. So I think there's more work to do to really understand what parental control might mean. Certainly, as Jeremy pointed out, it means that because schools are local, we are likely to find very different solutions to these issues in Mississippi than in Massachusetts. And where I think there really are deep differences across the party, and these aren't just racial differences, they're differences between white Democrats and white Republicans, is how do we talk on the issue of race? How do we talk about the nation's fraught history on this? When we ask people, what should schools teach about race? There's overwhelming agreement that we should teach that there's been progress on race, but there's gigantic disagreement about what that means in terms of confronting the past and the continued legacy of the past today. And that's where I see the fault line. It's just enormous. There are also fault lines in terms of how to handle issues of gender identity that I think are important to understand, and that worry me, frankly, in terms of the support that transgender students might feel in public schools in a variety of places. But those are the fault lines that I would see.
Yeah. I'm now wondering, like, it's my fault, but we've spent a lot of time on some of these cultural issues because they're obviously kind of salient, but it's a silver lining of the economic, what's the word? The economic difficulty that we're currently facing, that in some senses, like for the families, like the charts on inflation and interest rates. I mean, so we're talking about this now, but, you know, it seems like from the survey that a lot of American families have sort of bigger fish to fry right now. It's not that they don't care about these issues, but is that, I mean, I'm not saying that's not a reason to have runaway inflation, high interest rates, and a potentially huge recession. It's not the best way to end a culture war, but is there some sense of that, you know, we're talking about it now, but everyone else is like, what you just said, I can't fill a car up with gas and I'm worried about food, and you're talking about abortion and critical race theory. Is there any truth to that?
This doesn't have anything to do with the data that we have in front of us today, but other data.
We're in the last few minutes, so you can freelance for a bit.
All right, then I'm going to freelance and say, I think that the ideological character of American politics is shifting. And I think that one of the strange things that's going on is that, especially the Republicans and conservatives, are shifting in a much more ideological, cultural grievance direction. Now, you may be right that once inflation kicks in, right? Once we go through yet another year of the kind of economic pain, once people are looking at their yearly budget and resources, that this will change their attitude about things. I think that's entirely possible. But it does seem to me that there's this whole set of new issues that animate Republicans that Democrats don't want to talk about as much and are not as interested in. The problem is the other party gets a vote. And I think both of these parties are going to sort of push each other to talk about these issues, even when the issues sometimes don't necessarily make any sense. To bring it back to schools for a second, I totally agree with what Elaine said, that I'll put it this way. It's delusional for parents to believe that they're actually going to control schools, right? Because they're not going to. When the school board night election or even like input shows up, they have better things to do. They're going to be out to dinner. They're going to be watching Netflix. They're going to have other things on their mind. But something I always remind my students is public opinion is always worth being aware of, even when it is delusional. And so I think that this is an issue that the left needs to face up to, which is the public broadly, like when asked, wants parents to be in charge. That may be unrealistic, but it is definitely a current out there that I think is important. Chris is right. We're going to come up with new questions probably over the next few years to push on this and see where it goes. But it was so pervasive across both parties and in both directions that I just have this feeling the right political entrepreneur will figure out a way to make that an issue in elections.
Yeah, and as Elaine says, for now, certainly on the left, it's sort of true that in the run-up to the midterms, the Democrat strategy is to lean into reproductive rights, for example, post Roe. And so at least for now, you might be seeing that both sides, to some extent, are seeing advantages in leaning hard into those cultural issues, but different ones. Is that fair?
Yeah, and let me just make a separate abortion from the other cultural issues. Yeah. It's different. It is life and death and health for half the population. Okay, that's what this is about. This is about state interference in essentially what are in very, very often medical decisions. For most of human history, women died in childbirth, and they still do, or are damaged in some way. So this whole notion that it's sort of a cultural, religious issue, no, it's an actual real issue for 51% of the population, which constitutes 55% of the electorate. So it's a different thing than the other cultural issues. And I think that's important to remember.
And again, the other side would say something
note
similar,
here, though, Elaine, again, I was talking to a friend from Virginia, and she's pro-choice, and she's outraged by the Dobbs decision. But she's leaning Republican right now because she's also a mother, and she's seeing what's happening in her schools. I mean, just dramatic differences. We're not talking here, Chris, about just sort of how do we talk about history. We're talking about like just incredible ideas about gender coming through the schools. We're talking about gutting meritocratic programs in the schools. These are like huge changes that are unfolding. So I don't care if the Democratic candidates running for Congress are
Right.
trimming their sails to de-emphasize issues. On the ground in many public schools across America, there are radical changes that are happening that are leading folks, including pro-choice women, to reconsider their kind of orientation to supporting the Democratic Party. So unless and until, again, the Democratic Party shifts away from this kind of agenda on the ground in schools and gets back to looking at things like math and science and reading, I think they're going to be facing some real challenges, including among Hispanic and Black working class Americans who also often don't like these new ways of approaching education.
It's a great way to think about it, is that people being torn in different directions, maybe.
Sure.
on a lot of these issues, right? And you both put both sides of it there very, very well. Well, we've hit time, so I want to thank Chris and Jeremy again for your presentation, Deseret News and BYU for doing this survey. It always creates rich conversation, and you're always very open to the conversation, and obviously to my colleague Elaine and Brad for your comments back too. So thank you, everybody. Watch this space, and thanks for joining us all today. Be safe.
Thank you.